Un cimitir. Nimeni nu se mai ferește să spună că asta a ajuns Marea Mediterană. Peste 1700 de imigranți și-au pierdut viața în primele 4 luni ale anului încercând să scape de război, de sărăcie și de persecuții. Un număr record care a expus vulnerabilitatea comunității internaționale la o tragedie fără precedent în ultimele decenii. La fiecare 10 morți, 8 și-au pierdut viața în Mediterană și tot atâți vin din Africa. Iar pentru cei care supraviețuiesc, nu avem destui bani, destul loc, destulă voință politică sau socială pentru a le oferi ceea ce și-au dorit când au urcat în acele bărci, adică o viață mai bună. Dar Mediterana nu este singurul loc al unor tragedii fără pereche în istoria recentă, este doar cel mai apropiat de noi și poate de aceea ne șochează cel mai mult. Kenya și Al-Shabaab, Nigeria și Boko Haram, Irak și statul islamic. Cum arată situația cu adevărat în aceste locuri? Există vreo speranță de pace? Gândul a avut ocazia să intervieveze unul dintre cei mai mari mediatori mondiali din zone de conflict. Este vorba despre Prabha Sankaranarayan, președinta organizației Mediatori Fără Frontiere, care a venit la București pentru un congres internațional de pace. Are we witnessing the dreadful consequences of not doing enough in Africa, of thinking it was perhaps too far of our worries?
Alina, you're talking about the numbers just in Europe. If you look at the oceans around the world, those numbers more than double. Sadly, I think we are not only not talking enough about it, but not necessarily having the right conversations about it.
What is the right conversation about it?
There are many right conversations, and if you recall, over the last 2 months, we have had explosive situations in several countries in Europe. But if you look back over the last year, the last 2 years, what we are seeing is the impact of populations that are moving from their countries of origin because of the difficulties and the oppression that they're experiencing there, because of the violence in their countries of origin sometimes. And all of those are affecting not just the countries in the borders that you mentioned, but countries around the world. And so no longer is this a conversation for just Turkey or Greece or Italy to have. These are conversations for countries in the north to have. These are conversations that continents around the world need to be having. And the conversations I'm referring to are about the root causes of the reasons for this migration of populations.
So have we failed to properly estimate these root causes?
I think we have failed to have processes to address these root causes. Many of these are historical. You know more than I do the history of Eastern Europe. And for those of us who do the work of building communities together, of connecting people in communities, what we know is that when the history of a conflict isn't addressed, it continues to erupt in problems over time. So the root causes, when you say, have we not adequately addressed them, we have not. If we had, they would look a little bit different.
Ever since the growing crisis in the southern border of Europe, in the Mediterranean region, there's a growing political discussion now. And as we speak, there is an extraordinary EU summit in Brussels trying to tackle this crisis and trying to find solutions. But what do you think should be our main focus? More, I don't know, more money in the rescue and patrolling programs, perhaps a civilian military action against smugglers, more refugee centers in Southern Europe. There's a report coming out that EU leaders are trying to put a cap of only 5,000 migrants allowed to stay in Southern Europe, which would be absurd and totally unrealistic, since only in the span of a couple of days they have rescued 10,000 people in the Mediterranean, and hundreds of them have perished. So what do you think we should start discussing and assessing?
Well, when you are in crisis mode, the first thing is always the safety of the people. There is no question that no matter what we know we need to do, we need to address the immediate harm, the immediate danger that people are in. And there isn't a simple way to address it, and I think it was Tusk who said, we look for quick solutions. There isn't a quick solution, I know, for conflicts that are historically long. There are people who are at the center of these conflicts who need to be engaged in the process. There is no one we can leave out of it. So when you ask, what do we do first? I think we pay attention to the dangers that people are in immediately, of course. Safety should always be first. But if we stop there, we don't do anything to address what led to them being unsafe in the first place, right? So what that means is a longer conversation, and not just a conversation, but I think a commitment to staying engaged for more than the 2 seconds that people pay attention to on television. The leaders have a responsibility to pay attention for a longer period of time than how long somebody watches the headlines. It can't just be about the headlines. And the headlines can't just be about what grabs attention today. It has to be about how what is happening in these parts of the world no longer are isolated. What happens in Nigeria doesn't just affect Nigeria. What happens in Sri Lanka doesn't just affect India. It affects all of us. We've become increasingly connected as a globe, right? We are increasingly connected. So I am delighted that the leaders in the EU are paying attention to the fact that the EU as a community needs to respond.
Then let's go to the causes, to the root causes. And since from your experience across Africa and across the world, you know these countries better than most of us, and you know them firsthand. I would then ask you, what pushes these people who get into the headlines nowadays, what pushes them to almost certain death for some of them? What drives them to flee across the Mediterranean and in those dreadful conditions and containers in very, very small boats?
I can't pretend to know that I know about all of those situations. What I know in the years that I have spent working as a psychotherapist with children, with families, and with communities impacted by violence is that if they take the risk to flee in those conditions, you can only imagine that what they're fleeing is so much worse. And that is important to pay attention to, that they're willing to risk their lives because they are fleeing something that is so much worse than the conditions and risking death. These are people, they are not naive. They know that they're risking death, but it's with the hope that they reach conditions that are better than the ones they're leaving behind. Those who are fleeing conditions that most of us cannot imagine. I'll give you an example. When we started working, for example, in Liberia, this was right after the end of the protracted civil war in Liberia. We got a call, and there had been people who had fled the country, there had been people who had been made to do horrendous things during the war. So we got a call. We were very young as an organization, and we're not a very old organization, as you know. We were very young, and we got an email message to the founder of the organization from a refugee in a camp who said, we are in a situation where we have fought for 30 years, and we want to go back now that the war has ended, but we want the skills to go back. So these are people who had been living under these conditions for a long time, who despite the conditions they had lived under, felt motivated to do something. And so I'm starting with an example of post-conflict, and I'll get to the ones where I work with the women in Syria who are living under those conditions. So when you say what motivates people, the people in the camp in Liberia, for example, these were ex-combatants who had fought in Charles Taylor's small boys unit. They were forcibly recruited. They were grabbed from their homes, from their churches, from all of these places, 10, 12, 15-year-old young boys and girls, and said, here is a gun, you're going to go fight. People don't always have a choice about what they do. And so they fought, and they fought. And when the war ended, they were in a refugee camp. But they knew that if they went back without the skills to build peace, they would not be helping their country, they would be hurting their country. So they called us and said, will you come and help us build peace-building skills? So we got to the camp, and these people, Alina, don't know necessarily where their next meal is coming from, where they're going to spend the night. But what they showed up for every day is to learn about how to build peace. That's the kind of commitment we see in all of these countries. So even as they flee the situation they're in, when they're in a place where they can do something, a lot of them want to figure out how to go back and do something about what they have turned around and left. So we worked with these ex-combatants for the next 7 years, and I see their faces in front of me all the time. We worked with them at helping build community, at helping build up their own capacity. These were people who had lost their childhood. This group of young men had lost their childhood because from about 12 to about 22, they were living in a refugee camp. So we worked in partnership with a psychosocial program, we worked in partnership with a vocational training program, and they went back into those communities in which they had done so much harm and were able to become a part of those communities in a way that to me is a testament to the human spirit. They were able to go back and participate and contribute to the sustained peace in that country. And now I worry because over the last year, West Africa has experienced the Ebola crisis. And our friends and colleagues have been impacted by it. And you know what they're doing with the skills? They said, in these communities, you taught us to hold dialogues, you taught us to build relationships across divides. So now we're addressing the stigma of the Ebola impact by building those communities again. So when you start in one context, what you hope you have an impact for, I hope that we have an impact in a small way. And then you find that it spreads, that people carry that message into other places. And that's our goal in building the capacity for a peace-able world. So we don't work at the track one level necessarily. What we are looking at is how can we build the capacity in communities to build bridges, to have the kinds of conversations that most people don't see themselves having the courage to have.
There's something that strikes me, and that is that most of the bodies which are now in the Mediterranean and most of the people who thankfully managed to get to the shore safely, most of them come from Libya.
That group did.
And it strikes me because when you talk about Libya with people at NATO and in political circles, NATO is really, really proud of its actions in Libya, of the fall of the Gaddafi regime and the military operation that happened then. I was a part of a lot of NATO meetings where that was the case study of how effective NATO can be. And now we see that Libya is a country that is in such a bad state, a failed state, that people are willing to risk their lives to play this Russian roulette across the sea, just as long as they have a hope of leaving this country. What does this say about Western actions in countries like Libya and about the perspective we have and the narrow perspective we have, since we think we did such a good job then?
What does it say? It says that we didn't pay attention to what we needed to do over the long term. We had a woman from Libya, her name is Najat. She came to the International Training Institute, and I still hear her voice in my head. And she will say, what you left behind is far worse, because now everybody is running around the streets and they all carry arms. And you left too soon. You left too soon. So when we take the step to intervene in a country and decide that we know what is best, sometimes with people in the country, not always with them, then I think we have a responsibility to finish what we started and do it in a way that engages the people involved. How
this is
often
a conversation
do you think
that comes up very often, and with regards to, I think, all of the countries we have been involved in, be it Afghanistan or Libya or other places.
And that's the shift that I think we need to make in terms of questioning when, who, and how we get engaged. I used to think, when we thought about Afghanistan, I thought, one of the ways we could make such a huge impact is if all the money we spent on weapons, we spent on building schools. In 25 years, in one generation, we would have changed the face of that country.
One would argue that there wouldn't be enough people to go to these schools without the weapon part. The Afghanistan case is quite relevant because women were not allowed to go to these schools, even if the schools had existed.
Well, they actually never stopped anyone from building schools there. The schools continued to be built, and we continued to take lots of different kinds of actions. So when you go back to Libya and say, what else do we need to do? What I hear is the people from Libya saying you left too soon. What that makes me also think about is all of those other countries in which the immediate action that we take requires a commitment over a period of time. So it's not just enough to end what is going on because there is a regime that is oppressive. We need to play a role in building the capacity of the local populations in a way that allows that transition to take place in a way that they want. I'm not sure we're always tolerant of the choices other people make. So if we believe in true sovereignty, Alina, if one country chooses that its road to democracy is down this path and another says it's down this path, are we as interveners tolerant of the paths they choose? Or are we saying, no, if you want democracy, you have to do it our way? So when I think of processes that engage the population, if we engage, see, one of the beliefs we have as conflict resolution transformation practitioners is that the people who are impacted by the decisions, the people who are closest to the conflict have the answers. The people who are closest to the conflict have the answers to their resolution. So if those of us who live 5, 10, 20,000 miles away are engaged in a decision-making process that doesn't involve the people who are living with the legacy of the deeply divided history they have experienced, how stable, how sustainable is that solution? How many situations can you think of where people who were deeply impacted were a part of the solution, of the transformation afterwards?
Let me ask you this. Do you get the sense that we would be okay with the dimensions of the tragedies happening in Africa, for example, as long as we would not see these people dying on our doorsteps? Would we be okay as long as we would not see them dying so close to us?
I don't know. I spend more of my time in dialogue than in debate. And for me, that means truly understanding what the other side is thinking about. So while we can debate that keeping people far away, if we didn't have the images every day, so on the one hand, if we didn't have the images, it would be easier to ignore them, is what you're saying. But because they are at our doorstep, we have to do something about it. What I would like to see happen is before they get not just to our doorstep with our welcoming doors open, but on our shores, which is what is happening right now. So maybe we wouldn't pay as much attention if they weren't coming up in the way we are. But there are countries that are paying attention, and there are organizations that are paying attention by taking the proactive steps of working on the root causes in some of these places before the tragedies that we are seeing happen.